Thank you. When we were having a discussion for the panel before the session, there were a whole series of issues that came up, and we would love to talk about them forever here, but I do want to get the audience involved in a moment. So I'd just like to ask one last question to each of the panelists in turn and ask them to reply in just 1 minute if they can, which is the issue of the internationalization deficit. We've talked a lot about the benefits of internationalization, of the necessity of internationalization, the apparent inevitability of it, but what happens to countries that are not able to internationalize on the scale that we perhaps have been envisaging here? Is there a danger that there will be exclusion zones in the world? So perhaps I could start with you, Michael, and then we could just work our way along here, but pretty quickly so that we can then get out to the audience.
Well, I think kind of 2 points, really. First of all, internationalization isn't just what the Western world does, and multilingualism, for example, is a fundamental part of internationalization of education. And in a country like Rwanda, for example, most Rwandans, educated Rwandans, will speak Kinyarwanda, French and English, which is something that certainly isn't true in Britain. So there are kinds of internationalization that can happen in countries that don't have resources, which can be built upon. But secondly, again, it's about starting with the student. And if one looks at the kind of student needs in countries that lack the resources to internationalize in the way that are happening in other parts of the world, one notices quite an interesting answer to the question, because there the kind of student is often also a member of staff. And what one needs, therefore, to develop are new kinds of ways of providing educational support in the form of online programs, blended learning arrangements, faculty exchanges, shared curricula, which are not necessarily as costly as those kinds of internationalization which the Western world focuses on.
Thanks, Michael. Back to you, Eva.
Thanks. Just one area where I think exclusion is a real potential risk, and that is, according to our survey, when institutions are asked to identify the priority regions in which they're interested and in which they wish to engage in internationalization, the order of those regions remains the same for several years. Europe comes out first, Asia and the Pacific second, North America third. Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East are at the bottom of that list. But more importantly than that, if we look at those priorities in a disaggregated way and ask within regions, what we notice is that for Europeans, Europe remains the number one priority region. For the Asia-Pacific, Asia-Pacific remains the number one priority region. But for Latin America, for Africa, and for the Middle East, they're not priority for anyone other than themselves. And even there, they're not the first priority. So to me, that regional disparity is a very serious concern. And I would couple it with the pursuit of reputation being a strong rationale. If that is the case, then I think we do have a risk of leaving some institutions, some countries, and some regions by the wayside. And I think that is a real danger.
Yep. Thanks. John? No? You've got to pass for the moment. Michael?
Yes, very briefly, I think I agree with both of those two speakers. I won't add to that. Inevitably, universities or institutions like peer-to-peer coupling. And therefore, if that's not happening in some areas or regions, that's going to be a problem. You mentioned ICT, and I think that may be one of the salvations.
Thank you. Thanks. You mentioned?
I think there are two different strategies for internationalization for the developed countries and the developing countries or poor countries. So, the diversity is a base for the coexistence. So, with the development of internationalization, perhaps there is a risk for some countries or for some people lose their own characteristics or unique characteristics. I think that's perhaps a potential risk for the internationalization.